And speaking about mind control, the CIA also tried it with other animals. For instance, they once tried to, implant something in a cat's brain and then try to, get it to eavesdrop on others' conversations. And then once they finished the lab experiment, that they tried to see how it works. So they took the cat and they wanted to leave it around in a park where two guys were sitting and talking and see if this cat can overhear the conversation. But then the cat was run over by a car and the experiment failed. And but then they realized that the cat has a brain of its own, so it cannot be controlled. So again, yeah, again, so that experiment also failed.
Namaste, hello, and welcome to Citti Media. My name is Citti, your host. Today we are joined by Dr. Dheeraj P. He's an expert in intelligence studies. He has a PhD in intelligence studies from the University of Leicester, and his research focuses on cultures of intelligence and their relationship with strategic surprises. Dr. Dheeraj, thank you so much for joining us. Namaste.
Namaste, Sharan, and thank you very much for having me. And just a small correction, I'm a student of intelligence studies, not an expert of it.
Right. We're always students of what we learn. Absolutely. Now, there is a phrase that is going around in the Indian media circles in the last 2 days, and it's called Havana Syndrome. Now, it's a very, very interesting development because it could potentially upset ties between countries, is what strategic experts are calling. Now, for our viewers, what is Havana Syndrome and how is it even linked to India and why is it being spoken about?
Well, the Havana Syndrome, as the name itself suggests, it has its origin in the city of Havana in Cuba, right? So what we know is that earlier this month, the CIA director, Mr. William Burns, had visited India along with a colleague of his. And after getting back, his colleague reported certain health issues, which sort of tally with what we call as the Havana Syndrome. So going back to, it's reported that there are about 130 such instances which have been reported across the world. And in most cases, the victims have been American diplomats and intelligence officials, and to a certain degree, the Canadians as well. So going back to Cuba, this is around 2014 when the Obama administration, started the whole rapprochement program with Cuba. And in 2016, Obama made that historic visit to Cuba. And shortly after he did, some of the intelligence officials who were there at the US embassy in Havana started reporting certain health disorders. They started getting headaches, to listen to certain sounds when they did not exist. They experienced vertigo, a sense of loss of balance, disorientation, and so on and so forth. And some of these symptoms were acute, some were chronic. And in at least one instance, it was so bad that the person had actually had to retire from service and he couldn't get back after that. So why is this happening? There are three theories that have come forth. These are the three dominant theories that we know. One is that some psychologists feel that it is placebo effect in reverse. They call it a psychogenic illness, where it's a sort of a social construct. If I came and told you that, you're going to be killed today, right? So for the rest of the day, you are under that stress that somebody is going to come and kill you. So what happens as a natural response, your body triggers certain symptoms, right? And those could be the symptoms, the kind of symptoms that I just mentioned. So because the American intelligence and diplomats have been told that there's something like this in existence, it is possible that it's just the body triggering a certain kind of mechanism. So that is one theory. And the second is something that has been forwarded by Israeli researchers from Ben Gurion University. And what they say is that this is a consequence of overexposure to pesticides. Right. So they observed that many of these individuals, many of the CIA personnel, as well as the Canadian diplomatic staff who reported all of this, who reported these symptoms, they found that the Israeli researchers found that their houses, as well as their workspace, were overly fumigated for the fear of the Zika virus. So they believe that it is this sort of fumigation that actually triggers these symptoms. Right. So these are two theories that are sort of innocuous. But then there is a third theory, which is quite famous, and it was propounded by the Journal of American Medical Association. Now they actually studied these victims, and they found that there was some bit of brain damage, and which sort of resembled a concussion, but these victims were not hit by anything hard, right? So where did these concussions come from? So they concluded that it could be that they were struck by microwaves, right? Yeah. So now this is a theory that has actually got a lot of traction, and they believe that it could be the Russians who are doing this. And there is a certain historical precedent to this as well. I mean, these are not completely unfounded. Um, if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, especially from 1963 onwards, there was a weird phenomenon, what is called in the United States and in the Western world as the Moscow signal, right? Every day for about 18 hours a day, every single day, the United States Embassy in Moscow, it is being bombarded by radio waves to microwaves, right? Between the range of 2.5 to 4 gigahertz, which was then considered to be dangerous. So, I mean, nobody really understood why they were doing it, right? And it was just, I mean, some observers actually speculated at that point in time that probably the Russians or the Soviets wanted to trigger the electronic devices in the US embassy, and hence they were trying to do this. Some senior members within the US administration actually found it out that the Russians were doing this, but they did not inform the State Department officials. For a very long time. In fact, some of the diplomatic staff were furious when they discovered that this was happening. And it went on for, like I said, from 63 to about 77, 78. That's about 15 years. And towards 78, 79, it was only then that the Soviets stopped this as sort of a confidence building measure, because they were trying to, rekindle their relationship at that point in time. So to this day, we don't know why the Soviets did what they did. We just have these kind of speculations. So, and at that point in time, also some diplomats had reported some sort of health issues, but again, medical examinations proved that they had nothing to do with these kind of radiations, right? So we are back to square one. So we know that something is happening. There is a strong speculation that the Russians could be involved in it, but then it had one effect. That is the important part that I think you need to remember here.
Right.
What the Moscow signal did was many smart American diplomats then feared going to Moscow. They started coming up with some excuses, familial problems or whatever, and they did not want to have a Moscow posting. Now, we can draw parallels between that incident and the 2016, 2017 incident in Cuba as well, because in September 2017, the diplomat staff were called back. So if there was a faction in Cuba who wanted a relationship to sort between Cuba and United States, and if the Russians also wanted to ensure that Cuba did not fall into the so-called good books of the United States, then I think their objective was kind of achieved. But like I said, there is no hardcore evidence to prove that they were involved in any of this, but these are just grand theories. Right. So extrapolating from there, some people do think that, right now, India is getting closer to the United States, and we have frequent visits from a US person visiting India. So maybe something could be flying there as well. But like I said, these are all theories and speculations, and there is no hardcore evidence of anything.
Right. It's very interesting to know all of these things from you. It's extremely insightful. I mean, these are the theories that sort of keep me up at night. It kind of lets us explore the strategic dimensions of several parts of intelligence and how it's carried out across the world. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, in your research, you must have come across different spectacular examples of how intelligence is used by different agencies across the world. Some of them are very infamous and pertain to psychological operations that could have really bad impact on the minds of people who are being a victim to it. Now, could you share some of these experiments with us and the history of psychological operations in intelligence?
Yeah, so when you use the word psychological operations, it's a wide canvas that we're covering. But what I think you need to ask here is using biological and chemical means to have an influence on human psychology. Now, yes, there have been quite a lot of experiments done by intelligence agencies. I wouldn't say across the world because we don't have so much of evidence, but we at least know that during the Cold War, this was one of the part of the brain warfare that was happening between the Soviet bloc and the US-led capitalist bloc. This dates back to 1953, when the Korean War was almost coming to its conclusion. Around that time, some of the American prisoners of war who were held by the Koreans and these GIs who returned home, it was found that they had brought into the communist narrative. They felt that America was wronged, right? And at the same time, even the British found that this was happening. And the British also found another thing. They caught hold of a Hungarian dissident, right? And this chap actually started to confess to crimes that he had never committed, right? So there began, the then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Mr. Alan Dulles, he was delivering a lecture to the Princeton University alumni. And at that point in time, he mentioned the word brain warfare. So that triggered this whole chain where they realized that, the Soviets are doing something where they could control the human brain and then make them function the way they wanted them. So right after the speech, 3 days later, the CIA launched a program. It was called MK Ultra. All right. And this program, according to this program, then they started to conduct research on human mind to see how things like hypnosis, what kind of drugs can be used to control the human mind and all that. And LSD was one of the main drugs that they were trying to use, because LSD was quite a new drug at that point in time. Most people did not know what it was or how it would function on the human mind, on the human body, and so on and so forth. The British wound up the program in 1 year by 1954. At least, I wouldn't say officially wound up, but at least they became quite careful about what they were doing, for want of a better word, because one of their own scientific reports, when it reported that the use of LSD could lead to suicidal tendencies, right? And it was also proven in the United States, because later on an American airman who was sort of his drink was spiked by LSD, and he jumped out of his building and he committed suicide. So it was proven there. So 3 countries actually at that point in time were involved in this kind of research. One was the CIA, United States, of course. Britain, like I mentioned, the Secret Intelligence Service, and there was also the Canadian government, right? In fact, a major chunk of this kind of research happened in Canada, right? So there was this, who is notoriously famous now. His name was Dr. Owen Cameron, right? Evan Cameron, sorry. So he was a psychiatrist, and quite a famous one. He attended many of these American and European Psychiatry Association, and then he was also at one point the head of the World Psychiatric Association. So at this place called Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, it is part of the famous McGill University today. So there they started to conduct certain experiments, and these experiments were quite dangerous. For a very long time, people were sort of tortured, then sleep deprivation, and they were fed in drugs and all of that. And while I say this, I should mention that not all of them were quite dangerous, because there were also some serious academic work also done, where, say, for instance, one of the research papers that was produced at that point in time was to look at how a magician's art could be used for court operations, right, and all that. Yeah, it might seem ridiculous or crazy or whatever, but that's what intelligence agencies do. We're supposed to work with crazy ideas to see how they can be brought to reality. So they were doing that at that point in time, and the United States, the CIA had a front organization. It was called the Society for Investigation of Human Ecology, right? So this was a front organization that actually funded all these researchers, right? So it was not just Dr. Evan Campbell. There were others also who actually, there's one doctor called Dr. Martin something. He conducted his research in the University of Sydney, when the Australians had no clue that much of his research was funded by this particular organization, which was a front organization for the CIA, right? So the CIA had a knack of reaching out to all these so-called experts or so-called researchers who were working on all these kind of topics. So for them, what they wanted to do was, they knew that hypnosis and all these things, they were part of a mystic world. They wanted to bring it into real world and see how they could use it to control the human brain. And at least one notorious operation was Operation Midnight Climax, which was conducted sometime in the it was conducted in the 1960s, because 1973 they put an end to all of this, because the then director of CIA, Richard M, said, stop it, and you have to, all the documents were destroyed, and that's the reason we don't know much about it. In fact, in 1978 or 79, when it was Senator Teddy Kennedy, I guess he was the one who was heading the congressional hearing, and they wanted to know what the CIA had done. And most of the CIA officers who came there, they just kept telling that we've forgotten what happened, we don't remember, and all that. So the only way to then know is to follow the paper trail, but all the paper trail was destroyed. So there was no clear evidence of what had happened. But this one Operation Midnight Climax was, they got in a federal narcotics officer. His name was some Mr. White, and he because of his experience with narcotics, catching on narcotics and, dealing with all these drugs and all that. So they picked up a house in San Francisco, and he was made in charge of, adorning the house in a manner that it would, sort of spike a person's, sexual tendencies and all that. And he also got some students, engineering students, to bug the building, to bug the house. And then there was this, he was sitting on the other side, there was a two-side mirror and sitting on the other side. And so there, what he did was he called in some of these sexual workers to, and then there were some CIA officials themselves used in this experiment, where they were drugged with LSD, and he was made to observe what would happen, and all that. And but they used it. I mean, one of the, I wouldn't say a funny part, but the interesting part was that they used it to study concepts such as, honey trap, how it works, and all that. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk all of this on your show, but so at one point they wanted to see that, during this whole process of sexual practice, at what point could you elicit information and so on and so forth. So they didn't make a side study of all of it, but these are all considered highly unethical. So sometime in the early 1970s, an inspector general of the Central Intelligence Agency, he threatened to reveal all of this if they did not put an end to these kind of practices, these kind of experiments. And so then started the process of, sort of unwinding all the experiments that are going on. But I wouldn't say they put a complete end to it. But then later on in 1980s, some of the patients of Dr. Evan, they started to file lawsuits against the CIA and the Canadian government. And finally, by around 1988, the CIA settled all these cases outside the court. And even the SIS also settled some of the cases outside the court. And the Canadian government, I think in 1994 or 1997, in one of those years, they also made settlements with some of the patients who had then filed a lawsuit. And I think 77 individuals were paid about $100,000 each. So that is what happened. The Soviets, on the other hand, before going to the Soviets, I mean, even though the Americans did sort of put an end to these sort of experiments, they came back after the 9/11 attacks. Right? After the 9/11 attacks, they realized that, in order to elicit information from people they have caught, right? Because these are hardcore fundamentalists, right? Who are mentally very strong. They wouldn't give up on information.
Yes.
Well, the FBI followed a different path. They felt that, there are easier ways to get information out of him by empathizing with them, by connecting with them, by bringing them onto your side. But the CIA was in quite a hurry. So they again recruited 2 psychiatrists as part of contractors, and they paid them about $80 million to come up with what they called as advanced interrogation techniques or enhanced interrogation techniques. So these are what we know as torture techniques today. So instantly waterboarding, electric shocks, and all that we've seen in popular media today, they were all devised at that point in time. So at least one case, for instance, there was a terrorist. I mean, the word terrorist would be wrong today, but there's one suspect called Abu Zubaydah who was picked up, and he was held in one of the black sites in Thailand. And he was tortured for I think he was waterboarded about 83 times, and he was tortured for several months and all that. And finally, the CIA submitted a report that this guy is innocent, he knows nothing. Right? So even in the past, they had concluded that LSD does not work. Human mind cannot be controlled. And even after post 9/11 as well, we've seen that torture has its limitations. And speaking about mind control, the CIA also tried it with other animals. For instance, they once tried to implant something in a cat's brain and then try to get it to eavesdrop on others' conversations. And then once they finished the lab experiment, they tried to see how it works. So they took the cat and they wanted to leave it around in a park where 2 guys were sitting and talking and see if this cat can overhear the conversation. But then the cat was run over by a car, and the experiment failed. And but then they realized that the cat has a brain of its own, so it cannot be controlled. So that experiment also failed. Now, so if this was the case with the Western, with the United States, Canada, and Britain, it would be quite unlikely to believe that the Soviets wouldn't have done something like this, because for one thing, the Soviets, when you look at the strategy of warfare from the time of Marx, Hegel, Lenin, and Mao, they've always believed in the strategy of subversion, so that their warfare is always in the mind, which eventually leads to the annihilation of the enemy. So even before the Americans started, they did have a program on this. There's at least one very good research paper. I call it very good, though even though I did not understand one bit of it. It's too filled with jargons and other scientific words. So they have been having a program, and I think it continued until 2003. Right. So we don't know how far it's been successful, what kind of results it has had, because documents haven't been declassified. But that just that one research paper written by a very senior German scholar, we know that the Soviets did conduct it for until the year 2003. So yes, there have been experiments, that sought to control the mind, but I don't think any such experiments have had any serious successes.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. Those are golden nuggets that you've just provided us, and I'm sure our audience will find it fantastic. Especially when you spoke about the experiment with cat, it seems like it's right out of a Netflix series. In Sherlock Holmes, there is an episode called Hounds of Baskerville, and they conduct very similar experiments, and that we were thinking that it's too fictional, and now that seems very realistic compared to some of these experiments conducted by intelligence agencies. Now,
right.
I know that you're short on time, so
okay, just a small addition, because you bought the concept of movies and series, right? In fact, the Manchurian Candidate came out then in the 1960s, I believe, and that is what made the Americans feel that you could do something like this and control the brain of an assassin. So yeah, there is a connection with science fiction there.
Wow, very interesting. We should do a full show on that as well. But I know that we are short on time, so I'll ask you my last question. This week or this year observes 50 years of the Bangladeshi Liberation War. It's been one of the most strategic victories for India, and it's changed the dimension between India and Pakistan relations ever since. Now, we get to hear a lot about what the CIA has done, what the KGB has done, or Western intelligence agencies have done, because there is a system, there is a structure, there is a school of declassification after a few certain years, right? They have that culture. But in India, it is all very secretive, and not just India, but countries across Asia, if I must say. Now, what similar experiments has India conducted in the past? Anything that's in the public limelight? And how did intelligence play an important role in the 1971 war?
Straightforward answer to your first question, I have no idea about what kind of experiments in the similar domain that India has conducted, because I believe both India and Pakistan, they're more than happy torturing their enemies in simple ways, like put them to prison and get other people to beat them up or administer electric shocks and so on. So yeah, keeping that question aside, now coming to the question of the 1971 war. You see, what we know today, what is available, in popular literature, is that on December 3rd there was a surprise attack by Pakistan. There was a surprise airstrike where it is called Operation Genghis Khan. That is what General Yahya called it, and the intention was to sort of replicate a 1967 Israeli-style strike against India, and then achieve whatever warrants they had. But the Indian Intelligence Agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, which was established 2-3 years earlier, in September 21st, 1968, the agency had informed the Indian security forces that a strike is coming. There was a minor error in the date, but eventually we got onto it. So this is what we know, that we were very well informed in advance, and so we could take the enemy, we could counter surprise the enemy. But I think there's a very simplistic way of looking at the whole war, or the concept of how intelligence helps policy. Because in any event, there are two things that need to come together. One is a good intelligence as well as good policy, right? In fact, if you have a good policy without good intelligence, that is also good, right? But just good intelligence without good policy is of no use, right? And that is what used to happen even previously. When you look at the 1962 war as well, the Indian Intelligence Bureau had reported in 1961 September as well as June of 1962 that the Chinese are going to attack, right? But still, we were surprised when the attack actually came. So there are problems that way. So when you come down to the 1971 war, back in 1969 itself, 2 years before the war had happened, R.N. Kao, who was the then head of RAW, and his second in command, Mr. Shankaran Nair, both of them were very well versed with East Pakistan. And there was something known as the Agartala conspiracy at that point in time, where the Pakistani military actually arrested some of the naval officers and police officers and other political activists, and under the pretext that they had launched an attack on a Pakistani armory. Now, this event and the kind of repercussion it would have, the RNAW reported then and there itself in 1969 itself that it is possible, it is entirely possible that there is going to be a coup here. I mean, there's going to be a political turmoil here, which could lead to independence, right? Now, it's not just that the RNAW, submitted an assessment of this kind. It is also important to note that the then political leadership, Srimati Indira Gandhi, actually accepted it, right? Because at that point in time, there was a lot of pressure from the Indian diplomatic community, the Ministry of External Affairs, who were still operating in the Nehruvian thought that we shouldn't interfere in other countries' businesses and all that, right? So it is to the credit of the RNAW that they convinced Srimati Indira Gandhi that we need to launch an operation to liberate East Pakistan, to liberate Bangladesh. But at the same time, it is also to the credit of the political leadership that they accepted the assessment. And likewise, as the war progressed as well, there is always this kind of turf war between the intelligence agencies and the armed forces. Now, that is something that did not happen to a large extent during the 1971 war, because the then General Manekshaw, the famous Field Marshal Manekshaw now, he was heading the Chiefs of Staff Committee, which became the unofficial all-source intelligence assessment committee, where every day they would share the intelligence that they had. So there was a great camaraderie at an interpersonal level, at inter-bureaucratic levels, which all of it together ensured that we had a coherent policy, and nowhere did we falter, right? And so coming to the intelligence part itself, yes, our capabilities have significantly improved, because both the failure of the 1965 war as well as the 62 war led to a realization that we needed a dedicated foreign intelligence agency in 1968. So this agency was supported by some bureaucrats, such as very senior bureaucrats such as P.N. Huxer. And they really, very early on, we realized that we wouldn't be able to get much of intelligence from China and Pakistan directly because of their very stringent counterintelligence measures. So we received the kind of budgets that was required to establish intelligence posts and stations in Europe, say in Paris, because we wanted to observe what was happening in West Germany, where China was procuring some military equipment. And then we had posts in, say, Istanbul, where Pakistani officials or military officers were frequent visitors. And then we had listening posts in Mauritius, in Fiji, in Thailand, and so on and so forth. So to establish all of this, there was a coherent policy in the sense the political leadership gave a go-ahead. And so the intelligence bureaucracies did not have to worry much. So the capabilities were taken care of. And the other factor that we have to remember here is the Cohort operations that happened in Bangladesh. We're using the East Bengali Rifles and the East Pakistan Regiment. So these two became a very good source of information for us that, when you look at the order of battle of Pakistan in East Pakistan, we knew it down to the unit level, right? That's the kind of information that we had. So the military could not have gone wrong anywhere. So, that's one of the important lessons that we have to learn, that, cohort operations are very important if you have to have a very good strategic intelligence picture of your enemy. So, yeah, I think that these are three important points. I could just go on about this particular event for eternity, but I think I'll stop it here.
Thank you so much for sharing those valuable insights with us. And these kind of topics are very rarely spoken about, and especially on India's involvement in the Bangladeshi war. We just know the political aspect of it and we cherish the victory, but what goes behind the scenes and what kind of commitment and courage the intelligence agencies show is very less spoken about. And thank you so much for sharing these insights with us, Dr. Dheeraj.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on your show.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure too. And I hope you can join us again for such conversations.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. On that note, please do like, share, and subscribe to Citti Media. This is your host, Sharan Citti, signing off. Please stay tuned. We will be producing more such shows on current affairs.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.